Hey everyone. Today's topic in our discussion on world religions is a popular one, among my various series of lectures that I give in this class, and is often one that's highly requested by my students due to their slight familiarity with this group, or perhaps just curiosity about this group, that why they've always requested it. So today's topic is all about the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so, as always, we always like to begin our lectures with talking about some of the basic facts of the Jehovah's Witness. So, like their Mormon cousins within the Christian tradition, the Jehovah's Witnesses are a non-Trinitarian new religious movement that emerged first in the United States in the 19th century. It was founded by Charles Taze Russell, and they are known for their door-to-door evangelization of their religion and the public distribution of religious tracts. Very quickly, what is a religious tract? A religious tract refers to a brief pamphlet of some type of literary materials designed to both educate as well as persuade someone to their beliefs of the distributor. Religious tracts were made very popular throughout the Protestant Reformation because of their ability to be mass produced. Typically, they're very small. They can fit in with your hand or fit within your pocket. Just a couple of pages to read, so very quick to read. It's very easy to disseminate relevant information in a quick fashion. And tracts were also very easy to hide for Protestants during periods of religious persecution in the 16th and early 17th century in Europe. So, thus, religious tracts were very popular for all Protestant groups during the Reformation, not only because it also helped them gain followers, but more importantly, religious tracts were also used as a weapon to arm fellow Protestant believers to combat Catholic teachings and Catholic statements regarding the new religious movement of Protestantism, as well as various interpretations of the Bible. So it had a double-edged sword. Religious tracts were for propaganda purposes, of recruitment purposes, of evangelization purposes, but it was also for apologetic purposes. And if you remember during one of our early lectures, what an apologist is someone who defends ardently their particular religious beliefs in a philosophical and logical fashion. So this is what the purposes of the tracts. They also operated as an apologetic tool to help arm fellow believers of their like religion to combat people who was either against them or um, to kind of convince someone else of their religious truth. So the main point about religious tracts, and particularly for the Jehovah's Witnesses, that tracts were a tool. And tracts became extremely popular, very popular in the United States and Canada during the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, spurring various revival movements within their collective histories, spurring the creation and growth of new religious movements like the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so the history of religious tracts and the group of the Jehovah's Witnesses kind of go hand in hand. Particularly, well, in truth, just the history of religious tracts and new religious movements kind of go hand in hand. And so same with Jehovah's Witnesses. As of 2023, the Jehovah's Witnesses reported an active membership of around 8.8 million followers around the world. The largest demographics of Jehovah's Witnesses are Americans. Thus, it is a American religion. The next largest demographic group is Mexico, surprisingly, and Brazil, each of these countries having well over 800,000 followers within these countries. And then the next largest groups is countries like that surprise you because again, how diaspora, how spread out this religion is. The next largest groups are in Africa, particularly Nigeria, that have over 300,000 followers. Then you go to like the Philippines and you go to Japan, surprisingly, and in Italy with over 200,000. So you can see this very spread out religious movement. And so thus Jehovah's Witnesses can be classified as a global religion. However, I do want to point out here, and we'll bring this point back later, that I think that the number for the Jehovah's Witnesses statistically should be actually higher than what that the religion itself promulgates. And it's the main reason that this is kind of seen as a low number, 8 million people. That's less, little bit the size of the state of California, not California, New York. No, not New York. North Carolina. That's what I was going to say. It's, roughly the size of North Carolina, if not smaller than the state of North Carolina. So a somewhat small population, but in fact, their numbers are actually much larger because the Jehovah's Witnesses also have this practice known as disfellowshipping. And we'll talk about that later in this lecture, where they push members out of their church because of either theological problems that they perceive theological problems that the main group has with these members, or local memberships having infighting amongst their own membership. And so they'll push people out. They'll also push people out of their movement if they don't follow their practices fervently, or they'll push people out of their movement based off of lack of activity within their movement. And we'll talk about all these things. So most religious scholars and statisticians actually put the number much higher, possibly around 20 million people who self-identify as Jehovah's Witnesses. However, the organization itself, the religious organization itself, advertises that it only has around 8.8 million followers. So again, I think this number should be much larger, but we're going to go with the official point, the official number released by the church itself at this point. But I just want to make the point clear that in fact the number is much larger of people who self-identify as Jehovah's Witnesses, but might not be classified as a Jehovah's Witness publisher or follower within the church itself due to their strong practices of disfellowshipping, which we'll talk about later. Also, Jehovah's Witnesses, their places of worship are not called churches. They're not called temples. They're not called tabernacles. Several, common denominator terms that you see within Protestant faiths or Christian faiths. Rather, instead, Jehovah's Witnesses call their place of worship, they call them kingdom halls. And so kingdom halls are places of worship used by the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they're designed particularly for Bible study. They're also designed for worship, but more importantly, they're designed as a place for Bible study because that's the actual central heart of this new religious movement within Christianity. Bible study. That's how the religion got started, and that is at the very heart of the religion to this day, having Bible study. So if you do actually go and look inside a typical kingdom hall within the Jehovah's Witness movement, they don't really look like churches with pews, with a pulpit, with musical instruments, with an altar. You won't see religious iconography. Instead, it really looks like a lecture hall that you would see on a college campus. or an exhibition hall that you might see at a convention center or a convention conference that you go to um, as well. And it's purposeful. It's purposely designed this way because it's designed for the purpose of study. And so it doesn't really have raised platforms. Like I said, no musical instruments, no religiosography, because at the heart of this religion is the study of the Bible. They're very, very committed to that. And so the name Kingdom Hall also reflects how Jehovah's Witnesses see themselves. And so that's very important. They see themselves as citizens, actual citizens of God's kingdom alone. Thus, Jehovah's Witnesses are not citizens of individual nations like me and you. They don't see themselves as an American or as a Canadian, as a German. Instead, they see themselves as solely citizens of the kingdom of God. And so even within the name of their meeting house, their place of gathering, their place of worship reflects that ideology. They're called kingdom halls to overemphasize that. So again, I want to make clear the definition of kingdom hall here. For your purposes and for your notes, kingdom halls are places of worship used by the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they're designed for Bible study, worship, and activities that reflect the purpose of the organization to promote good news of the kingdom of God. Hence, kingdom halls. While the Jehovah's Witnesses do not form a large part of the population of any country that they reside in, they are thus considered minority groups. And if you recall, a minority group, a minority religion specifically, refers to a religion whose population and cultural status are not in the majority, and whose religious traditions and generally and whose religious traditions generally develop due to external social forces, persecution, and we'll see that specifically when we deal with Jehovah's Witnesses. They're also minority religions are also subject to religious intoleration within their society. And again, we will see that as we discuss the history of the Jehovah's Witness movement within the United States. And many of you guys may be already aware of this fact that Jehovah's Witnesses have and do experience intoleration, religious intoleration, and religious persecution in many countries in which they reside. They're not very popular. And we'll talk reasons for that. A lot of it's because of their political beliefs that are bled into their theological beliefs and vice versa. And the United States, particularly, a country that is known for our religious freedoms, have at times persecuted the Jehovah's Witnesses because their theology starts to bleed into their politics. Now, I would like us to revisit several key words and key phrases in this introductory statement that I have on the screen here at the very top here about the Jehovah's Witnesses, to pull out and to isolate several key terms that are used in this statement to not only better flesh out an understanding of who this group is, but also to emphasize more about their theological traditions and their religious beliefs. So I bolded some of these key terms that I want us to focus on, and so we're going to kind of flesh some of these out here. So the first is actually not on the screen here, but something that I said. The first is that I described the Jehovah's Witnesses like their Mormon cousins within the Christian tradition. So the Christian tradition The Jehovah's Witnesses are, in fact, a Christian denomination. They are part of the Protestant branch of Christianity, even though some Christians would disagree. So I want to repeat that. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a part of Christianity. They are a Christian denomination. And more specifically, they are a Protestant denomination. But I want to emphasize again that not all Christians see the Jehovah's Witnesses as Christians, and we'll explain why. Like all Christians, the Jehovah's Witnesses believe in salvation. Salvation offered by Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, and the Jehovah's Witnesses believe in the Christian Bible. The Jehovah's Witnesses are very Bible-centered, like most Protestants. Very much, many of you could possibly relate to this. Baptists are very Bible-centered, Bible-minded people. Methodists are very Bible-centered, Bible-minded people. Presbyterians as well, Pentecostals as well. These are things that are very common to these Protestant denominations, and you find that as well within the Jehovah's Witness movement. The Jehovah's Witnesses consider the Bible to be the inspired word of God and the primary source of religious authority, like their Protestant cousins. Ergo, this is why I'm emphasizing that the Jehovah's Witnesses are a Christian denomination and they are a Protestant branch of Christianity. However, there are some key theological aspects that the Jehovah's Witnesses disagree with Protestants, and vice versa, which thus leads to their kind of confrontational, their conflicting stance within Christianity. Why you might hear your minister at your local church or your priest at your local church might condemn the Jehovah's Witnesses and not see them as part of Christianity, because there are some key theological concepts in which the two are polar opposites. So, back to that phrase, like their Mormon cousins. The Jehovah's Witnesses are part of a branch of Protestantism that we scholars of religion, and particularly American scholars of religion, call Restorationism. Restorationism refers to a belief system within Christianity that argues that mainstream religious traditions should be and need to be restored. Hence, Restorationism. Need to be restored to their original origins and to their original practices in order to fix not only the perceived conflicts and disagreements and disunity of the Christian church, but also to fix the world as well. These Christians, these restorationists, they believe that the early beliefs and the early practices of the followers of Jesus, the first church, the first apostles of Christ, that they believe that these early practices and beliefs were either lost over time, or more importantly, that they were adulterated after the death of the first followers by substandard followers of Christianity and unbiblical institutions. So what does that mean? So they believe that some of the traditions, like that of the Catholic Church, who claim to have an unbroken tradition of religious practices and religious authority and religious command that go all the way back to Saint Peter himself, one of the very first apostles of Christ. However, there's certain practices within the Catholic Church that don't literally appear in the Bible, that do not literally appear in the pages of the New Testament, but appear centuries later. How do we explain that? Well, for the Restoration movement, they explain it that, aha, this is a sign of a corruption, unbiblical institutions that established it. So therefore, these restorationists believe that what is required of God and of all Christian followers is a restoration towards the true faith and the true teachings of Jesus Christ and the early apostles that has been lost but now has been recovered. They see the divisive history of the Christian church, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, the Orthodox Church, all of the various heresies that emerge within Christian traditions, the Cathars, the adoptionists, the apollinarians, the Nestorians, the Arians, that all emerged throughout Christian history that caused all of these conflicts. These Christians, these Restoration Christians, believe that it is a direct result of wrong teachings by these institutions and a failing to live a biblical life. They argue that there would be no theological differences between the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Christians, the Protestants, if only the true teachings of Christ and the true interpretations of the Bible were actually preached and actually followed. And that there is division within Christianity right now because the wrong leaders have emerged. And these wrong leaders have given out false teachings which have been as followed by the church and thus have become a false tradition and an institution that needs to be corrected, that needs to be broken down, that needs to be retailored. They also believe, the Restorationists, that all of the atrocity caused by the church throughout history, an example would be like the Spanish Inquisition or the various witch hunts throughout the 17th century, the Crusades, the anti-Semitism that emerged in Europe. All of that is the direct result of the wrong traditions and institutions being established within the church and thus corrupting the church and thus corrupting world history and the world. So therefore, the Restoration, this movement, seeks to correct faults and deficiencies in other branches of Christianity or in Christianity as a whole by appealing to all Christians to go back to the practices of the early church, to go back to the beliefs of the early church, or you'll see this term as well if you study Restorationism, the quote, primitive church. And that this primitive church is in fact the normative model for best practices and for best beliefs within Christianity. Thus, sometimes you might hear this phrase referred to Restorationists as Christian primitivism. So you might see Primitive Baptist Church around. That's a good example of a Restoration movement. The Mormon Church is another example of a Restoration movement. But here, for our purposes in this class and for this lecture, we'll talk about them as Restorationists. Like I said, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, to an extent, Pentecostals, Assembly of God, Church of God, Disciples of Christ, Landmark Baptists, Primitive Baptists are all part of this restoration movement within Protestantism. And so, ergo, that's why I argue that Jehovah's Witnesses should be included as a denomination of Protestantism, as a denominationism of Christianity. I personally do not see the Jehovah's Witness as being something separate and should be treated as something separate. Instead, I think that they should be properly labeled as a branch within Christianity and understood in that light as a branch of Christianity that is different. I've got no bones about that. That is significantly different, like the Mormon Church. It's significantly different in various key terms. But we typically, religious scholars, that we would label and really block the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons into something else. And we typically call that restorationism as its own denomination. So maybe that's how we should think of it. And that's what I would argue for, is that within Christianity, what we should see is instead of having three typical branches, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Protestantism, we should add a fourth branch to either include that we call non-Trinitarians, and then we'll get to that word here in a minute, or Restorationism as a branch. Also, like their Mormon cousins, the Jehovah's Witnesses are purely an American religion. Like the opening text up there on the screen says, that they emerged in the United States of the 19th century. The Jehovah's Witnesses are an American religion. We should think of them in that term. And what does that mean, an American religion? What it really just means is that this is a religious tradition whose origins and foundations occurred within the boundaries of what we call the United States of America. So that would include Scientology, that would include Mormonism, that would include Pentecostalism, that would include the Jehovah's Witnesses. It would also include Christian Science movement as well. The Salvation, well, no, not the Salvation Army. That's a little bit different. So these are an American religion. And therefore, much of the religious makeup and the background of these religious movements that emerge in the United States, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, are linked to American history and American culture. And so to understand the Jehovah's Witnesses as a religious movement, you also need to understand America's religious history as well. Like their Mormon cousins again, the Jehovah's Witnesses are what we refer to as non-Trinitarian Christians. So what does that mean? So I know I've already discussed this in our Mormonism lecture, but I want to repeat it here as well. Non-Trinitarianism refers to a theological viewpoint that rejects the doctrine of and belief in the Trinity. And it differs widely among each other non-Trinitarian group concerning the nature of God, the nature of Jesus, and the nature of the Holy Spirit, and their relationship to each other. And so if you recall back from our discussion on Christianity, while Christianity is a monotheistic religion, meaning that it believes in only one God, in truth, Christianity is what we refer to as a soft monotheistic religion, meaning a belief in one God, but who appears in many forms. And for Christianity, that soft monotheism is entailed in the doctrine of the Trinity. And so that's a central aspect of the major forms of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and almost all forms of Protestantism. There are some that aren't Trinitarian, like the Mormons, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, like Unitarians. And so really quickly, what do I mean by the phrase the Trinity? If you don't recall from Christianity lecture, Trinity refers to one supreme creator deity, God, existing in three co-eternal distinct persons. The Greek word there is hypostasis. And that these three co-eternal distinct persons share one essence, or they share one nature. The church term in the creeds, or in the Greek term that's used behind this essence and nature, is homoousin. And this is expressed in the Trinitarian prayer, or when Catholics, when they do the sign of the cross, they'll say, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, God the Father, God the Son, Jesus Christ here, and God the Holy Spirit. Three co-eternal distinct persons who all share one essence and one nature. And so those who believe in this Trinitarian form, we naturally call these Christians Trinitarian Christians, or sometimes we call them Nicene Christians, after the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 that we talked about in Christianity lecture, that was overseen by Constantine the Great. This is where the definition of the Trinity was cemented as orthodox teaching by the Christian church. It was publicly debated and publicly defended as a biblical principle that is found throughout the pages of the Bible, not explicitly said. To give credit to my Jehovah's Witnesses friends and my Mormon friends, the Bible specifically does not outline the doctrine of the Trinity word for word, but however the ideas of the Trinity are clearly expressed in the pages of the New Testament. Specifically, the best image used throughout so many Protestant churches on stained glass windows, Catholic churches as well, is the moment within the New Testament of Jesus' baptism. You have Jesus being there, being baptized by John the Baptist, and Mark's gospel and the rest of the gospels give this passage of that once he was baptized, that the heavens opened up and everyone heard the voice of God saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." So we have the image there of God in heaven, the clouds popping up, the voice of God being heard, Jesus, the Son of God, and God even says, "This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased." But the Bible also mentions that the Spirit of God descended on him like a dove. And so that scene of the baptism of Jesus is the epicentric, the penultimate image that is used within Christianity to describe the Trinity, and is the basis of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. So Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and almost all kinds of Protestants are Trinitarian Christians. So we use that term to help distinguish between these other forms of Protestants, like the Jehovah's Witness, like the Mormons, like Unitarians, who are non-Trinitarians. So what about the Jehovah's Witnesses? The Jehovah's Witnesses, however, do not believe in the Trinity. Instead, the primary basis for the rejection of the Trinity is on their direct and literal interpretation of specific Bible verses and their understanding of God's oneness, which is at the heart of the Old Testament. Particularly remember the Shema from our study in Judaism, Deuteronomy 6:4. There is no God but God. They argue the Bible consistently presents God as one being, Jehovah, and that Jesus is his Son, a created being, not part of the Trinity. Because the opening passages of Genesis is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's just one singular entity mentioned in the pages of Genesis. So the Jehovah's Witnesses again point to Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. It does not say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is three in one, but one. It clearly says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. Jehovah's Witnesses also point to New Testament passages, John 14, verse 28, where Jesus says, the Father, God, is greater than I am. Meaning, how can Jesus be co-equal with God like Christians, Trinitarian Christians believe, if Jesus himself says, God is greater than I am? In order to be greater than, you cannot be co-equal. There has to be a hierarchy. There has to be levels. So therefore, the idea of homeostasis doesn't exist within the ideology of the Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as Mormons. And so the Jehovah's Witnesses argue that the Bible does not explicitly teach the Trinity, but rather the concept of the Trinity was developed over time outside the Bible, aka the Council of Nicaea in 325. The Bible does not explicitly use the words Trinity to describe God, nor does it directly teach the idea of the Trinity. Instead, it indirectly teaches the idea of the Trinity, and that is what the Catholic Church and Protestants and Orthodox Christians have argued throughout the centuries. But the Jehovah's Witness says, no, it was finally nailed in for them that this is a teaching of the church and that it was established at Council of Nicaea by someone like Constantine, an unbiblical institution that was established externally of the Bible, externally from Jesus Christ, externally from the first apostles and from the first church, and externally from the New Testament. And so this is why we call them non-Trinitarian Christians and why they're a little bit different. And it's because of that key part that they do not believe in the Nicene Creed. That is a staple. If you go to a Catholic church, you're going to say the Nicene Creed at some point during the Mass. That it's not because they do not believe in the Nicene Creed. People like the Catholic Church, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians would say, ergo, they're not Christian. Because that's, according to the Council of Nicaea, that is the definition of being a Christian. However, biblical scholars, religious scholars, American historians would argue instead, no, what we should do is reclassify the Jehovah's Witnesses. Yes, they are a part of Christianity. Yes, they're a part of the Protestant faith, but they are significantly different, and that's why we have this other characterization of them and categorization of them as non-Trinitarian Christians. So this other branch of Christianity, or as I talked about, we can also categorize them as restorationists as well. And like their Mormon cousins, the Jehovah's Witnesses are a new religious movement. And they can be classified as a founder religion. And so if you recall from our previous lectures, new religious movements refer to a religious or spiritual group that has relatively modern origins, but who are on the periphery of society's dominant religious culture, and who are characterized by their innovative and unorthodox beliefs, unorthodox practices, or they have a charismatic leader that also we tend to characterize them by. The Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly, they emerged as a separate religious movement in the United States in the around 1870s, but more specifically like 1880s. So that's less than 200 years ago. So that definition and that categorization of a new religious movement fits pretty well in comparison to the Catholic Church that's 2,000 years old, to Islam that's what now? Doing math real quick is 1400 years old. Um, Judaism, that we're not sure when it began, but let's say 3,000, 4,000 years ago. So again, this is a relatively new religious movement. But they're also founder religion. And so if you recall from previous lectures, founder religions refer to a religious tradition that is based on the teachings of a specific individual or individuals, and is in contrast to indigenous religions that emerge organically and over time, but without clear origins. The founder of the Jehovah's Witness movement is Charles Taze Russell. And the Jehovah's Witnesses was made into an organized and global religion by its successor, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, both men who we'll talk about later in this lecture. And finally, the Jehovah's Witnesses are a proselytizing religion. I realized I didn't bold the phrase evangelization, but I should have here. But I want to bring this up here. This is my mistake on the slides. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a proselytizing religion, or we sometimes will use the phrase a missionary religion. And what does that mean? We've already talked about this with Buddhism, with Christianity, with Islam. It refers to a religious tradition that actively attempts to convert and or persuade someone to adopt their own religious beliefs and practices. And you guys definitely may have experienced this in your life. Jehovah's Witnesses are very evangelistic. They're very active in seeking out converts. They may go literally door to door to door to door within a neighborhood, or in order to convert, to talk about people, you might have seen them, they might have come to your door as well. But here lately, in the past 15, if not 20 years, they've kind of changed their tactics and mainly have activated as a primary distributor of religious literature to the general public. And I know I've seen them, and you might have seen them as well. What was it? Gosh, couple of months ago, both me and my wife went down to St. Augustine just for a vacation weekend, a staycation, in that sense, to go to the beach, go to a nice hotel, go to a nice restaurant, and play tourist in St. Augustine just for fun when we could. And I remember we got out of the parking lot there, next to the old town and to the tourist center and close to the fort that's there, the Spanish fort, and right in front of the parking garage, what do I see? I see two Jehovah's Witnesses with their stand distributing out religious tracts to people who were interested. Last time I was in Savannah about a year ago, I saw them at the park there, I think at Oglethorpe's Park in Savannah. There's the Jehovah's Witnesses with a stand. Two of them, it's always going to be two of them, that are there with their stand distributing out religious literature. So they're very public. You do see them. They have, so anytime you see two people standing next to a little stand, magazine stand that has little brochures and has like a little magazine looking document there, chances are those are Jehovah's Witnesses. And so, in fact, Jehovah's Witnesses, because of their commitment to proselytation and their commitment to evangelization and commitment to missionary activities, the Jehovah's Witnesses themselves call their followers publishers. Publishers. Because they view themselves as publishers of the good news of God's kingdom, and that this title reflects their active involvement in publicizing and sharing their beliefs with others, often door to door, but more importantly, through publications, through the distributing of published materials that they produce. So they call themselves publishers. Okay, so I think that's enough of some of the basic facts about the Jehovah's Witnesses. So now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty, time to get into the origins of the Jehovah's Witness as a religious movement. So prior to jumping into the biography of its founder, Charles Taze Russell, and the early days of the Jehovah's Witness as a movement, I think it's important for us to discuss the very roots of the movement, that the very roots of the ideology that spurred, that surrounded the Jehovah's Witness movement early on. And in fact, there are two key driving factors within American religious life that lead to the development of the Jehovah's Witness as a separate, independent Protestant denomination within American Christianity. Those two driving factors are, one, the Second Great Awakening, and we'll talk about that here momentarily, and the emergence of a religious movement within Protestantism, particularly American Protestantism, that we call Adventism. So let's dive in to the first one, the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a major, major Protestant religious revival that swept throughout the United States, roughly from the 1790s throughout up until the mid and late 1840s. So a very long period of time, a 50-year period within American history, and at the beginning of America's foundation as a country. So why the Second Great Awakening is so fundamentally important to the makeup of the religious history of America, as well as the political and cultural makeup of America, because it occurred right at the beginning. The revolution just happened. The American Revolution just happened not 20 years ago in 1776. The country becomes established after 1781, and the Constitution and George Washington and them emerge in 1789. So this is pretty new. And you have a huge revival, Christian revival movement that emerges. And so this revivalistic movement, the Second Great Awakening, was characterized by passionate evangelical preachers, characterized by emotional religious experiences that occurred either at the meeting or among its followers. And it saw a surge in church membership across various denominations, particularly Baptist and Methodist at this time. And it saw, more importantly, the democratization of religion in the United States, as well as an emphasis on individual piety, but more importantly, on personal connection with God, making faith more accessible to ordinary people, which is why America is so gosh darn religious. Because one of the great inventions of that the United States gave to the field of religion in history as a human endeavor is they forced religion to compete in the free market by democratizing it, by allowing churches to stand on their own two legs. And so thus, there's no more state sponsorship like there is in the Church of England that's sponsored by taxpayer government. So that's why a lot of people don't go to church anymore, because it's not necessary. They're paying for it. They don't need to go. But instead, why churches here in America are vibrant and full, because of the religious experiences. They have to draw people in and have to keep them in. So thus, religion, faith, experientialism, having emotional experiences when you go to a church is very vital. And so that's why if you go to churches, and why churches now are using rock and roll music, are using light shows, are having dynamic preachers who are very charismatic, who are using technology, and who are dressing kind of cool and hip and look like social YouTubers, It's all purposely designed because they have to keep the audience, keep them engaged, keep them attracted, and keep them invested in the church. And that's how the church grows in America. It democratized it, but you'll see that churches now employ free market capitalist principles in keeping church membership instead of in Europe, where you don't see that at all because a lot of the churches there are state sponsored, so they don't have to reach out to you. Why they're not very evangelical. But in America, they are. And it started with the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening saw the emergence of all sorts of new religious movements in America. From the Shakers, who don't exist anymore, but who were prominent in New England throughout much of the 19th century and early 20th century, to the Oneida movement that happened in the 1840s, to the Mormons, who emerge and who become a dominant new religious movement within the American tradition. They started during the Second Great Awakening. And ultimately, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who emerged much later than the Second Great Awakening, but its roots as a religious tradition start in the Second Great Awakening. So that's why we're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening. But more importantly, what did the Second Great Awakening do? It saw the emergence of a new phenomenon within the Protestant church, and that already kind of highlighted already evangelicalism. So very quickly, what do I mean by evangelicalism? And how is it different from evangelization? Evangelicalism refers to a dynamic and influential movement within the Protestant Christianity that emphasizes the experience of having a personal conversion, of having personal experiential faith, and the importance of sharing the Christian message with others. Evangelicalization or evangelicalism is evangelicalization. So that's the difference here. It's an it's an ideology that emerged within the Protestant tradition and became linked to Baptists, who were very evangelical, who are very mission minded, Methodists, who are very evangelical, who are very mission minded, Pentecostals, very evangelical, very mission minded, but also Mormons, also Jehovah's Witnesses, who actively recruit members. At the heart of both the Second Great Awakening and evangelicalism that gets produced during the Second Great Awakening is a very simple philosophical idea that emerged in the UK but took root in the United States, particularly within Princeton University, which is a Presbyterian founded university that for a long time and still does trains ministers to be trains ministers for churches. We don't think of Princeton, an Ivy League school, in that term, but Princeton, you can Google it. Princeton has a seminary, and it's a very good seminary that trains ministers. And this ideology emerged in Scotland and then it came to the United States through the Presbyterian Church, which the Presbyterian Church is a Scottish religious movement, and thus to Princeton University, which was established by the Presbyterian Church of New Jersey there. This philosophical idea is what we call Scottish realism. So Scottish realism was a philosophical movement that originated in Scotland during the 18th century and during the Enlightenment, and was a reactionary movement against the philosophical skepticism of the day that questioned the reliability of our senses, questioned our ability to actually know the existential world. Scottish realism was created, it's credited to a Scottish philosopher named Thomas Reid, who was a contemporary of another very popular, very famous Scottish philosopher who gets more praise than Thomas Reid, um, the famous philosopher David Hume. And so, if you're in introductory to philosophy class, you're probably going to study David Hume, and you're going to study his form of philosophical skepticism. Thomas Reid was a contemporary. He was alive during David Hume's. I think they were the same age too, or if not, Thomas Reid was the senior of the two. Thomas Reid was very critical of David Hume and his form of historical criticism, and his arguments eventually emerged into what we call Scottish realism. Scottish realism argued that we can have a direct and intuitive knowledge of the external world through our five senses. That our senses provide us with a foundation for knowledge. How we know things is through our senses, and how we can know what we know with any level of certainty. If I can touch it, it's real. If I can taste it, it's real. If I can see it, it's real. If I can feel it, it's real. That's what we know is real. That seems very common sense, and so sometimes Scottish realism is called common sense realism. So, I really love Scottish realism philosophy. It really makes sense. It's very empirical. But Scottish realism rejected the idea that our senses and our perceptions were merely what we would call representations or ideas in our mind, meaning that what we experience as the real world is not directly assessed by us, but rather what philosophical skepticism would say is like rather this data that we see requires interpretation by our mind. Thus, what we see, I see a red apple, in fact, is not a red apple, but is a mental construct of the data that we see. So technically, that real apple doesn't really exist. It's a mental projection and a mental interpretation that we place upon it. Meaning that what we perceive is not the thing in itself, but rather a mental projection or a mental representation of that thing. So you might sound confusing. So let me give you an example. Let's go back to the apple. Imagine that you're looking at a red apple. Someone like David Hume would say, well, the light reflects off the apple and it enters your eye. That this light stimulates the cells in your retina, sending signals to your brain. Your brain processes these signals and creates the perception of the color red and a perception of what an apple is. An apple's red and it's kind of round. But what you're actually seeing and what you're actually experiencing is not the apple itself, but rather what you're experiencing and what you're seeing is your brain's interpretation of light reflecting off the apple. So it's not the apple itself. So it's a very nuanced idea. So how do we truly know that the color of an apple is red or that the shape of the apple is kind of round? Is it your mind that interprets as such, or is it the reality of the apple itself? And that what you're really seeing is the color red, and what you're really seeing and your mind is interpreting is really a round shape. That is what philosophical skepticism was trying to understand. How do we really know what we know? It is questioning and trying to understand how we can truly know anything and understand what is truly true. If you want a better example than the apple, I just thought of it real quick. Think of pop culture. Think of the Keanu Reeves Matrix movie. Do we live in a computer simulation? And how would we ever know if we are living in a computer simulation? That is what philosophical skepticism was trying to deal with and argue out. How do you know that you're not in a simulation? You really can't know Because is it my mind projecting this? Is it the simulation that's projecting this, telling me that famous scene where the guy is eating steak and he says, I know this is coding that's telling me the steak's going to taste like this, and it's going to be juicy, and it's going to be good. And when I put it in my mouth, I experience this, but how is this not coding? I know it's coding because he's seen, the wizard behind the curtain. That is what we're kind of talking about here. But what Scottish realism is on the opposite side of that spectrum, the opposite side of this debate that the Matrix movie was doing. Do we live in a computer simulation? How would you ever know unless someone outside wakes you up and shows you? Scottish realism instead asserts no. We can truly perceive the world as it is, and that we trust that perception through our own inherent senses. It argues that we perceive the external world directly and not through intermediary mental representations or mental ideas and projections, but rather from what we actually see, what we actually hear, what we actually taste, what we actually touch. Those things are real. It is not a mental copy, nor is it a projection of the object in question. So back to the red apple. When you look at the apple, you are directly perceiving the idea, the not the idea, but you're directly perceiving the object itself. You're directly perceiving the apple itself. It is not a mental representation. It is not an idea in your head. And yes, while light is reflecting off the apple and it does enter your eye and create this kind of projection of what you see in your mind, however, that light is not an interpretation. That projection is not an interpretation or creation of your mind. Rather, it's a recognition of a reality. You perceive the apple, you perceive its properties. You're seeing red because that's what it is. It's red. You're seeing its shape sort of round because that's what is there. That's what's really there, a kind of round apple. You're experiencing and understanding its texture of this fleshy orbed object because that's what it actually is. And the redness that you perceive is a real quality of the apple existing in the external world, not in your mind. It's not just a sensation created by your brain. It's a reality. And you can understand and comprehend this reality through your five senses. So what Scottish realism does is it moves Descartes. If you remember Descartes, his famous maxim, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, or I think therefore I exist, is the better translation, into a very pragmatic and empirical way. It shifts it from cogito ergo sum to sentio ergo sum. I feel, therefore I exist. If I can touch it, if I can see it, if I can smell it, if I can taste it, if I can perceive it, then it's empirically real. And I can be assured of my senses as an ultimate reality. If I can put it in a simpler way, our common sense belief in direct perception is justified by our direct experiences. Again, that's why Scottish realism is called common sense realism as well. Now, what does all that crap, what is all that philosophical jargon your head might be spinning? Now, what the hell does this have to do with religion, man? I'll tell you. Within Christianity, how can someone know that they're saved by God from the fires of hell? How? How can someone know with certainty that their faith in God is real? It's an empirical fact. In America, at the turn of the 19th century, most Protestant Christians were Calvinistic. They were Calvinists. They believed that salvation is entirely the work of God from beginning to end, that they held onto the doctrine of predestination, meaning that God has chosen those he will save, the elect, before the foundations of the world, and that your choice and belief in God was a far gone conclusion, that you didn't have really a say in it. It was all God who chose this, because God is all powerful, God is all knowing, God is all loving. So you really don't have a choice in the matter, that you thought you had a personal experience and a confession, but in truth, it was a far gone conclusion of fate that God had already predetermined. So how does a Calvinist Protestant Christian, which again was the majority of Americans at this time, how do they know that they're saved? Well, generally Calvinists would argue that there are two primary ways that you know you're saved. One, they would quote from Galatians chapter 5, the fruits of the Spirit, meaning that a changed life is evidence of salvation. Galatians 5, Paul talks about, he lists the fruits of the Spirit as being love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And the consistent pattern of these qualities in a person's life is an indication of their true faith. But the emphasis here is on the word can be. Because people who are not Christians can easily display the fruits of the Spirit in their own lives: love, joy, peace, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, kindness, goodness. You don't have to be a Christian to have these things in your lives. Kindness and goodness are not exclusive to the Christian faith, but rather a quality of human behavior and choice. So how do you know I'm saved? So Calvinists would say, okay, there's another thing, assurance of faith, meaning that Calvinists place a high value on the assurance of faith, and that this assurance is based solely on the promise of God in Scriptures, which means that you have to believe in the complete inerrancy of Scripture, meaning that the Bible is 100% correct in everything it says and does, and that it does not have any error on anything it says. But with the increased discovery of science that contradicted the claims of the Bible, it became harder and harder for people to completely trust in a 2,000-year-old book. Thus, ultimately, only God can judge the state of a person's soul, and that judgment happens only upon your death. So that's a very high risk. A very high risk to be assured of your faith and salvation from hell. Meaning that you have to wait until you die to absolutely know if you're going to heaven or hell. Again, that's a high risk, with eternal damnation or eternal salvation as the reward of you choosing wrongly. Am I saved? Do I know I have faith? But this is bringing all of this together, Scottish realism and the Second Great Awakening and religion. Something new happened that was introduced within the preaching of the Second Great Awakening that was directly influenced by the philosophical notions of Scottish realism. And that idea is being born again. Being born again. That phrase comes directly from Jesus in the Gospel of John, when he encounters a religious man named Nicodemus who asks Jesus about faith, who asked Jesus the very same questions that these Calvinists were answering. How do I know that I am saved? Jesus answered him, saying, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. So naturally, John chapter 3 talks about Nicodemus is really confused by this statement. Nicodemus says in the Bible, how can a grown man enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born again? That seems impossible. It's not possible, Jesus. What the heck are you talking about? And so Jesus has to clarify his previous statement and says, except a man be born of water and of spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, but that which is born of spirit is spirit. Nicodemus in John 3 still is confused. And so Jesus compares being born again to the wind. He says you cannot hear it, you can't or that for the wind, that you can hear it, you can feel the wind blow, but you don't understand what generated it. Yet you know the when exists and that you can comprehend the idea and the notion of when because of what? Because you can feel it. You can sense it. Ergo, Jesus is saying faith is likened to a feeling, something that you sense and that you know to be true. And so here's the parallel. And so for Scottish realism, many ministers applied this common sense based philosophy to faith and religion. How do I know I have faith? How do I know that I have been saved by God from the fires of hell? The Second Great Awakening preachers gave a new answer. You have to have an experience, a religious experience. You have to be born again. You have to feel God, and you have to experience faith in order to know you're saved. That's a huge change in Christianity, something that the Americans had introduced, this idea of experiential faith. And you can see that's what we talk about nowadays. If you go to a Protestant church, you go to a Catholic church, it's all about feelings, all about experiencing God, having an emotional response while you're in church, because you know then you have a relationship. You know then you are saved. And so after the Second Great Awakening, Christianity in America became more and more based on having experiential feelings with God, being born again. And you see it in our Protestant churches. Music becomes the centerpiece of the church. You raise your hands while singing, singing with your eyes closed, singing while clapping, crying, dancing in church, speaking in tongues, having altar cards, being slain in the spirit. All these things emerge out of a need for experiencing God, a need to know that the faith I have is real. Hence, Scottish realism helped to make that real, because if you can feel it, then it's real. It's empirical. That's why when you ask someone if they're a Christian, and why at 9 times out of 10 you'll get an experiential answer. I became a Christian because I felt God, in the basic summary of what somebody says. Rarely do you hear someone say, I'm a Christian because I was born into it. My mom and dad are Christians, so that's why I'm a Christian. People give that answer typically are viewed by other Christians as not really being saved, because they didn't have a born again experience. Within Catholicism, we call those cradle Catholics. We even have this term for them. Oh, they were born into it, so they really didn't get to know and experience God, didn't have a conversion experiences. They were just told what to believe. And we view them as a little bit less. And this is what you now have is a birth of evangelicalism within the Protestant church that later bleeds into the Catholic Church as well. And so regarding a definition of being born again, I would say it refers to a central concept in evangelical Christianity. And it does not refer to a physical rebirth, but a spiritual awakening that comes from an experience with God. And so with the Second Great Awakening occurring in the United States, and experiential feeling with God at the heart of this revivalistic movement, you have the emergence of new religious movements that are all based on having experiential encounterments with God. The Shakers are the best example of that. They're called Shakers because they would literally shake themselves during a service. They would convulse on the ground and be shaking on the ground because they were experiencing God. Hence, we called them the Shakers. In today's religious tradition of Jehovah's Witnesses is also one of those examples. Because they're so committed to a literalist interpretation of the Bible, because they're so and committed to evangelization and proselytization, it's a form of experientialism to know that their faith is real. The second key development, we talked about this, excuse me. We talked about the Second Great Awakening, Scottish Realism, Born Againism, and now we're going to talk about the second key development that we need to know before diving into our subject, and it is the Christian movement known as Adventism. Adventism refers to a branch of American Protestantism that originated in the 19th century and is characterized by a significant emphasis on the imminent second coming of Jesus Christ, which is known as Advent. So that's where the term Adventism comes from. Advent means second coming. So it's not to be confused with the Christmas season of Advent, but they are related. If you're Catholic and you celebrate Advent, Advent is not only about the emergence of, celebrating Christmas, but more importantly, at the heart of Advent, it's about thinking about Jesus' second coming again by reliving his first coming and celebrating that, but with your mind thinking about his second coming. So Advent, they're related, but like I said, don't be confused that, oh, Adventism means Christmas. It's not. Adventism believes in the imminent return of Jesus Christ to earth, and that Christ's return will happen at any moment. That's what imminent means, any moment. And that this belief is therefore central to their own religious tradition. Now, the phrase, the imminent return of Christ, refers to this belief within Christianity that Jesus Christ could return to earth at any moment, and his return is a moment of final judgment. And that this belief emphasizes the idea that Christians should live in a state of readiness, ready for Christ's return, as it could happen at any moment. And also really quickly, I use the term final judgment. So what does that mean within Christianity? Final judgment refers to a significant event within Christian theology where God will judge every person who has ever lived based on their deeds and whether they accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. There is no specific event or prophecy that needs to be fulfilled before Jesus comes back. It is unpredictable, and no one knows the day or hour of Christ's return, making it impossible to predict. But however, there are people who try to predict it because they want to know. They want to be ready, be truly ready. So we'll talk about that level of prediction. But at the heart of it is like, well, you can't really know, so you just need to live in a state of readiness. Thus, um, thus, Christians are commanded to live in a constant state of readiness and prepared for Christ's returns at all times, prepared in their faith, prepared in their good works, and specifically prepared by spreading the gospel constantly, evangelizing, missionizing. And because of this impededness, there's a great urgency that Christ's return creates among believers to share the Christian message and to live a life that is pleasing to God right here and right now. Thus, there is a motivation for holy living, and that Adventism should remind Christians that this world is temporary and that their ultimate focus should be on the eternity always and never about this world. So this is another reason why Jehovah's Witnesses call themselves citizens of the kingdom of God. It's to emphasize again their belief in Adventism, that Christ's return is happening any day now, and that by calling themselves citizens of the kingdom of God, it's getting them in the mindset of being ready for Christ's imminent return any day now. Adventism emerged from a popular new religious movement that emerged at the tail end of the Second Great Awakening from 1822 all the way through 1845. The new religious movement that spurred the idea of Adventism were called the Millerites. The Millerites. The Millerites were American Christian followers who followed the teachings and the prophecies of William Miller. thus why they're called Millerites. William Miller was a Baptist preacher in upstate Western New York, and you'll see this is upstate Western New York was where a lot of new religious movements emerged. Mormonism emerged there, the Oneida movement, and to some extent the beginnings of the Jehovah's Witness movement as well. Uh, uh, Miller Miller believed in intense Bible study. And he believed in biblical prophecies, especially Daniel chapter 8, verse 13 and 14, where it says, I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the visions to be fulfilled? The visions concerning sacrifices, daily sacrifices. The rebellion that caused desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. And the voice said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. So that's a very important philosophical or theological passage for Adventists and for the Jehovah's Witness movement. Miller believed that that phrase at the end, the cleansing of the sanctuary, or the sanctuary will be re-consecrated, was to be reinterpreted as representing Earth's destruction by fire at the second coming of Christ. So this is when he believed Jesus Christ was coming, and the Bible had a code that was apparent for everyone to read, but no one was able to interpret it properly except Miller. So Miller, using a day equals a year interpretation from another biblical passage, Ezekiel 4:6, Miller became convinced that 2,300 days equaled 2,300 years, and that he calculated that this day started in the year 457 BCE, with the royal decree to rebuild Jerusalem from the Persian Emperor Artaxerxes I, who authorized the Jewish prophet Ezra and Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem to accompany the exiles and to restore and rebuild the city of Jerusalem that was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. So using this very simple calculation for Miller, he then indicated that Christ's second coming would occur in the year 1843. This happened in September of 1822, and that's when Miller went public with his prophecy and published it. Now, initially Miller wasn't very popular. He didn't have a lot of followers, but however, around the year 1831, his prophecies began to start circulating to the wider public audience in America. And he was especially aided by a publicist named Joshua von Himes, who created a national campaign on behalf of Miller to advertise his prophecy through newspaper publishings that you could subscribe to. The mailer, this newspaper mailer, was called Signs of the Time. Such a great name, great marketing name. And it was distributed as religious tracts. Remember, religious tracts? We're having our connections here. They were distributed as religious tracts, and getting Miller to go on speaking tours throughout the United States, throughout churches, where he would dictate and show his biblical prophecies just reading the Bible, and it was very convincing. By the 1840s, Miller was a religious phenomenon in the United States, and had around 600,000 followers across the United States as well as parts of Canada. Churches across Protestant denominations began to side with Miller and became his disciples. He had a new religious movement ongoing because of this fervent belief in Adventism that was emerging, and because Miller could show quite easily through the Bible and just reading the Bible in a very literal form, this interpretation that made it very acceptable for people to believe and see as real. And so again, had over 600,000 followers in the 1840s. But, but once 1843 arrived, the prophesied date that Miller had done, Miller was started to be pressured by his followers and even the American press to give an actual predicted date as to when Christ's second coming would occur. When, within the year 1843, would Jesus come back? And so, in response, Miller wrote that he believed Jesus was going to come between the dates of March 21st, 1843, until March 21st, 1844. So he modified his beliefs, gave a little bit of wiggle room, but an entire year. And that was the time that he calculated. So, as March 21st approached in 1843, then Miller said, "Oh, Jesus is not going to come back until the year 1844." So everybody's like, "Oh, okay." So they're getting excited, they're getting ready, they're waiting, they're ready. Many people started to sell their personal belongings, their possession, their homes, their lands, their livestock in preparation for Christ's second coming. They were expecting it. There was over 80,000 people in Cincinnati at one time at one of Miller's rallies because of how fervent a belief it was. But when March 21st, 1844 came and went and nothing happened, Miller started to panic. The press the press published articles ridiculing Miller and his failed prophecy. And on March 25th of the same year, Miller gave an update, said, oh, I miscalculated. I did an error. Instead, Jesus is coming back April 18th of that year of 1844. And Miller cited that, the error was I was using the Jewish calendar in my calculations instead of the Christian calendar, because I believe, Daniel was doing his prophecies on Jewish calendar, but in truth, God told me that, it's actually the Christian Gregorian calendar that I should be using. So we're all good. Again, April 18th, 1844 came and went and nothing happened, and the press continued to ridicule Miller. But yet he didn't lose any significant followers. He eventually, by August, said, Jesus is going to come back again in October of 1822, citing the specific hour of Jesus' death on the cross as his inspiration for his new interpretation that hours equals days or equals months. So, again, October 22nd, 1844 came and went and nothing happened. And thus, Miller's series of predictions became known in the press and in American history as the Great Disappointment. Newspapers began reporting in Ithaca and in Dansville and Scottsville, New York, Miller's churches being vandalized. In Lorain, Illinois, a mob attacked followers of Miller, beat them with clubs. In Toronto, Canada, believers of Miller's prophecies, Millerites, were rounded up and publicly tarred and feathered as a sign of ridicule. And so by 1845, the Millerites themselves started to break up, and they began to create small religious movements on their own, based off their own interpretations of Miller's failed prophecies. While most of them didn't make them, there was a few that had very interesting beliefs, and I just want to highlight them for you. So these are groups that spun off Miller's original religious group, and so these became secondary religious movements that really didn't last long, but they have very creative beliefs and names. So one group was called the Shut Door Adventist, and they believed that Miller's prophecies were true, but they were just misunderstood by the general public, and that rather that the door of salvation had been closed on October 22nd, 1844, and that no one else after that date could be saved. So that everybody who was saved before then is fine and dandy, but everybody who's not saved afterward, they're all going to hell. Naturally, this group died off and didn't grow. So, but I love their name, the Shut Door Adventist. Another group were called the Childlike Adventist. Childlike. They believed that to prepare for Christ's return, they needed to emulate the innocence and the humility of children. It comes from that famous passage in the New Testament where Jesus says, "Come to me like little children." This led to some unusual behaviors by their members, like particularly having childlike speak. Not so much talking like a baby, but using very simple words, constructing very simple sentences that a toddler would say. And so imagine having hearing a 30-minute or an hour sermon, given in the speech of a toddler. Think of that. And some of them believed that they needed to have childlike actions. So during the church services, they would literally crawl on the ground during worship services and cry like a baby as well. So those are two interesting groups. But the majority of the followers of Miller just rejoined their previous denominations, or they joined other religious movements of their day, like the Mormon Church. Two main groups did emerge that had staying power from the makeup of Miller's following, and they actually created their own denominations within American religious Christianity. Those two groups are the Seventh-day Adventists, who continue with Miller's teachings, but adjusted them in light of all the failed prophecies. And the second group are the Jehovah's Witnesses. So for the remaining of our lecture today, we're going to talk about the Jehovah's Witnesses. So now let us move to, like all new religious movements, let's start talking about the founder of the religious movement, Charles Taze Russell. Charles Taze Russell was born in 1852. Was born to a Scotch-Irish migrant family who settled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So that's kind of the heart of the Jehovah's Witness as a movement. I think Charles Russell Taze's grave is still in Pittsburgh, if I remember right, and it's somewhat of a pilgrimage site for some Jehovah's Witnesses. In his youth, Charles was a member of the Presbyterian Church. Being Scottish, most Scottish descendants are members of the Presbyterian Church, and worked at his father's haberdashery store, drawing up contracts and bills of sales for his parents' business. Eventually, Russell would inherit his father's clothing business and actually expand it. He was a very successful businessman. I think by 1876 he had built 5 department stores, little shops, haberdashery stores in the greater Pittsburgh area. So he was actually kind of wealthy and a successful businessman. At the age of 16, however, he took a great interest in religion. And he began studying various perceived faults within his own Presbyterian traditions, such as contradictions in stated beliefs like the Trinity, along with various other church traditions that really don't have any precedence in the Bible. Something like Ash Wednesday, that's celebrated by Catholics. It's not really there. Or even certain positions, like where is the position of a bishop or a cardinal in the New Testament that the Catholic Church has? It doesn't really exist. There's no pope. Um, Truly, there is no pope in the New Testament, the pages. That's something that church tradition has created. So this started naturally led Russell to start questioning his own faith. And he began investigating other Christian traditions that he encountered in the greater Pittsburgh area, but ultimately concluded that they didn't really provide him any answers in what he was seeking. So at the age of 18, he began attending an Adventist church in his area. And at that time, it really inspired him to study the Bible more intensely for himself. And this zeal for Bible study led Russell to establish a small Bible study group amongst his father's friends and investors in 1870 to analytically study the Bible, the origins of Christian doctrines, of creeds and traditions, studied the writings of other Adventist ministers, particularly George Storrs and George Stinson, were popular Adventists at the time. And Russell's group concluded that many of the primary doctrines of the established church, particularly the Trinity, doctrines like hell as a place of punishment, and the inherent immortality of the soul, were not sustained by Scripture at all. That these beliefs were inventions of church tradition, not stated in the Bible itself. However, everything changed for Russell and his Bible study group in 1876 when he met Nelson Barber, who was an influential Adventist writer and publisher of the day. Russell was so moved by Barber's teachings and Barber's understanding of biblical prophecy, especially his prophecy that all Christians who had died and were buried would be raised again in April of 1878. And that Jesus would spiritually and invisibly return to the earth in 1878. So Russell really believed in this and became full-hearted believer and was convinced of Barber's message. He was convinced so much that this successful businessman sold all 5 of his stores for a price of $300,000 in the 1870s, which is equivalent today to $8.5 million. So he had $8.5 million in the bank, and he decided he loved Barber so much that he's going to bankroll Nelson Barber and his ministry and his publications. And so they became partners. He became a financial partner, and the two of them started to support Barber's ministry, and they both became publishers. In 1877, both Barber and Russell published a book together, 2 books, in fact. They published The Object and Manner was one of them, and the other one, The Object and Manner of Christ's Return, or the Lord's Return, if I remember right. And the second book was The Three Worlds and the Harvest to come, which outlined their theological beliefs and outlined their teachings. They also began publishing a periodical newspaper to help disseminate their ideas and their message, known as the Herald of the Morning. Oh, such a great name. Which had thousands and thousands of subscribers. Russell began to lead actually Christian revivals, and particularly stressing the imminence of the rapture and the second coming of Christ. And naturally, this captured the attention of many Adventist Christians and many non-Adventist Christians who started to kind of populate both Russell and Barber's um, new ministry that they established. Very quickly, I use that word rapture. I don't think I've ever defined that, so I want to define it here. Um, the rapture, it refers to a Christian belief based on First Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 through 18, uh, which concerns an end time event where all Christian believers, both living and dead, will suddenly be taken from the earth to meet Jesus Christ in the air prior to and during the tribulation. And that phrase tribulation refers to a period of time of intense turmoil and suffering for all non-Christians that is predicted to occur on the earth during the end times. But those people who um, but those people who are left during the period of the tribulation can become Christians during this time as well. So that's very important. You might have read the Left Behind series. Like the Left Behind series is all about the period of the tribulation and kind of speculating on that. And those books begin with the rapture of the people that just mysteriously disappear. So where am I? Oh yeah, yeah. April of 1878 naturally came and went. Barber had predicted that this is when Jesus Christ is going to return, and he actually predicted that this is when the rapture was going to happen, and we're actually going to see people who are dead be resurrected from their graves, and everybody lift up into the air and ascend up to the air where they'll meet Jesus Christ in the air. That's what Barber taught and believed, and so when April of 1878 came and went, and nothing happened, the failure of Barber's prophecy brought a lot of great disappointment to the two men and to their followers and to their subscribers and readers. And it forced both Barber and Russell to really re-examine their beliefs and debate and start debating amongst themselves. And then it became public that they were debating themselves within their newspapers, that Herald of the Morning, concerning whose interpretation was right and correct, and as an explanation of what would happen. The two men began publicly fighting, and the two men separated over their disagreements by 1879. Russell withdrew his financial support and, of course, naturally started his own journal, which he called the Zion's Watchtower, and issued their first publication in July 1879, and started to attract readers and followers again, while Barber started his own religious movement that's known as the Church of the Stranger, which doesn't exist anymore. I think it died out when Barber died in 1905. So but Russell started to become successful, and by 1881, Russell founded his own kind of religious group, but it was more of a business. He founded the Zion's Watchtower Tract Society, and later it would just be shortened to Watchtower Society, to help disseminate his ideas as religious tracts, to help disseminate his teachings that were composed in order to correct Christian doctrines and Christian misinterpretations of the Bible that were prominent during this period of time. And with the formation of the Watchtower Society, Russell really intensified his ministry and his Bible study groups and started to grow them to hundreds and hundreds of church groups in that sense. And over a 4-month period in 1881, Russell's Watchtower Society had distributed 1.5 million religious tracts throughout the United States, parts of Canada, and even Great Britain. And by 1903, Russell had a 15 million subscriber list just in the United States and Canada alone to his Watchtower tracts. He was starting a religious movement. And In 1886, he published uh, his most famous 6-volume series known as The Studies of Scriptures, which sold 20 million copies by the time of his death. And with the advent of film, Russell even organized and directed a 4-part audiovisual roadshow production called the Photodrama of Creation, which ran from 1912 until 1914 with some 9 million tickets sold to his event. So he was becoming very popular, very movement. And at this point, uh, Russell's teachings and his belief began to spread and really became organically a, a new religious movement within Christianity. But they didn't label themselves as that. They were all members of a tract society. They just saw themselves loosely organized as a Church of God or Church of Christ or just Christians at this point. The name Jehovah's Witness doesn't come until much later. But in addition to his publication efforts, Russell really becomes a religious leader, a de facto religious leader of this new religious congregation that he created. And so he starts acting like a religious leader. Um, Russell established his first congregation in 1879, who only had just 30 members, but they would meet for 6-hour periods a day to study the Bible and to examine the Bible and the writings, his writings particularly, as well as other Adventist writings of the day as well, to see if they were accurate and true, to kind of think about it and play. And that was kind of how their church organizations were first established. It was large study groups, and that was kind of the impetus of their services. It wasn't, here's a sermon, here's some songs, we pass the plate, we take communion, none of that. It was intense Bible studies that became their services. Russell encouraged more study groups to emerge within his tract society, and he encouraged them to be what he called autonomous ecclesia, or what we'd call self-governed churches, which he called a return to primitive simplicity of the New Testament. So he believed this was very biblical, to have local churches have local autonomy. Um, um, Southern Baptists operate in that same modality as well, very self-autonomous church. In 1882, Russell wrote that the groups were strictly unsectarian and consequently recognized no sectarian name. He would go on to say that we have no creed, we build no fences to bind us together or to keep others out of our company. The Bible, he says, is our only standard, and the Bible is the only teachings, and that the Bible is the only creed that we will have. Um, so he's trying to create this very democratic and organic religious movement, but he writes later in 1844 that, well, appropriate names for our groups that we could call ourselves are churches of Christ, churches of God, but those names are already taken as well. Just to kind of, but the point of bringing that up is that you can see he's starting to separate himself out from others as well. That, well, we're not Baptists, we're not Adventists, we're not Presbyterians, we're not Methodists, we're something else. But he doesn't quite say what we are. He encouraged local congregations to elect elders and deacons, the only 2 offices that the church in the New Testament recognizes. So this is very biblical in Russell's mind. And Russell tolerated a great latitude of beliefs initially among his members. Russell discouraged formal disciplinary procedures by congregations and elders, claiming that his authority, that this was beyond their authority, but instead he would recommend that entire congregations judge an individual who continued to do wrong. So he kind of introduced this idea of disfellowshipping, which meant that whole congregations should shun the wrongdoers in all social circumstances and all social activities until their behavior or their beliefs are corrected. And so this was a very popular movement to create church, very popular church practice to reinforce behavior and correct behavior by publicly shunning people, basically. This is what Amish do and Mennonites do as well. In 1894, Russell introduced the role of pilgrims within the church, and that these were men who were chosen for their maturity, for their meekness, and for their Bible knowledge, who would then travel around and visit various congregations to give talks and to lead advanced Bible studies. So you start having somewhat trained ministers now emerging, but they called them pilgrims. And these pilgrims who initially served part-time, but would later become full-time workers of the Jehovah's Witness movement later on. And finally, in 18, I think it's 81, Russell publicly encouraged all members who were to go forth as what he would call co-porters. It's a weird term, co-porters, but they were really evangelizers, or preachers, and they encouraged them to go to their neighbors in order to gather gather the flock, as he would say. So this is the first introduction in the early 1880s within the movement of kind of creating a missionary mindset, that these colporteurs would travel door to door to their neighbors or to their neighbors' places of business, leaving religious tracts, leaving pamphlets that with everyone that they visited, and that they would return days later to inquire if those people had read the tracts, if they had any questions, that they could answer them, and so to kind of create this dialogue between them. So these were kind of missionaries at this sense. Later, these colporteurs were renamed to pioneers in the 1930s by Joseph Rutherford, and then later they got renamed to just basic publishers. And this is the daily activities of Jehovah's Witnesses within the group. So that's enough of Russell's background and him trying to create a religious movement, but I really want to focus on next concerning what Charles Russell actually taught. Russell saw his work as restoring Christianity to the purity of the first century roots of Christianity. Russell agreed with other Protestant denominations on the primacy of the Bible and on various doctrines like the justification by faith alone or priesthood of the believer. However, Russell believed that the errors that had been introduced in the Protestant and in the Catholic interpretations of the Bible's practices, that there have been errors that have been introduced, and those things need to be corrected. Russell believed in the concept shared by many restorationists in the 19th century that was emerging in American of this idea known as the Great Apostasy. What does that mean? The Great Apostasy describes a belief that a significant falling away from the true Christian faith as established by Jesus and as established by the apostles had occurred quite early within Christianity. And thus this idea posits that the decline occurred sometime after the first century AD and led to widespread corruption of doctrine, corruption of practices, corruption of authority, and corruption of traditions within the church for centuries. So restorationists believed that the original teachings and practices of Jesus and the apostles were either lost or corrupted over time, such as the loss of authentic priesthood authority, the idea of spiritual gifts, and proper church organization. And so they see many practices and doctrines established by the church today as human inventions, that they have no basis in the original Christian faith. Examples include creeds, because they're not in the Bible, but they are inventions of humans later on. Elaborate rituals like the rituals of the Mass, something like Ash Wednesday rituals within Catholic Church. Those are things that don't exist in the Bible. And even the complex hierarchical structure, both of the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church and even some Protestant churches. Again, there's no such thing as a cardinal. There's no such thing as an archbishop. Within the New Testament, there's no such thing as a metropolitan. There's no such thing as a pope. Within them, there's only elders and deacons, and teachers or episkopos, which is also the word for bishop, but that's a side story. And so the great apostasy is often described as a period of spiritual darkness and a period of decline, where true Christianity was largely absent and obscured on the world stage, but it could be recovered. And so that's what the Restorationist movement believed. They were about recovering the original traditions of the Bible. And they were doing it through their own interpretations of the Bible, either very strong literal interpretations or even having metaphorical interpretations, or like the Mormons, a part of the Restoration movement, having divine experiences that lead to new interpretations that need to be recovered. So for Russell, Russell's scriptural interpretations differed significantly from those of Catholics, of Orthodox, and of many Protestant denominations, and they disagree in the following areas. So, one, regarding hell. Russell's taught that there was a heavenly resurrection of the 144,000 righteous, as well as a great multitude that's mentioned in the book of Revelation. But he believed that the remainder of mankind would not go to hell and suffer in a literal hell of fire and brimstone that we think of, that we see portrayed in movies, but rather what the New Testament seems to indicate, and what the Old Testament more specifically indicates, hell was a place where mankind slept. It wasn't a place of punishment, but it was a place where man slept. The idea of Sheol that's present throughout the Old Testament of the Bible, particularly there's the episode with Samuel and Saul, King Saul, where Samuel had already died, and King Saul visits a necromancer who awakens Solomon, or not Solomon, but Samuel from his sleep. And even Samuel says in the Bible, I was sleeping. So therefore, Russell takes it quite literally. Well, this place is a place of sleep, not a place of suffering and punishment. So Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in a literal hell of damnation and suffering that most Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox Christians believe in. Hell as being a place of punishment. Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe that, because they cite the Old Testament scriptures that do seem to indicate that that's how the early Jews believed in this idea of Sheol as a place of sleep instead of a place of hell and punishment. Speaking of the 144,000, Russell believed that the 144,000 mentioned in the book of Revelation, chapter 7 and chapter 14, was a literal number that referred to a literal group of individuals. Now, there is this misconception about Jehovah's Witnesses that they only believe that 144,000 people will become Christians and will be saved, and that only that small number will be saved. If that was true, then they wouldn't have a recorded membership of 8.8 million if they actually believed that. So like I said, it's a misnomer that gets associated with them. Instead, what Jehovah's Witnesses believe, and what Russell saw, is that the 144,000 refers to a special selected group within Christianity, chosen by God for a special purpose. And that's what the book of Revelation seems to indicate, because it mentions the 144,000, but then also right after that mentions a great other multitude. So who are the other multitude? Well, that's the other people that are saved, but there are a specific select group of people who are pulled out and designated for a special purpose. Excuse me. Russell taught that the 144,000 would be resurrected to heaven to reign as kings and priests with Christ himself during the millennium. Now, that's a term that we haven't described in this class yet. The term millennium refers to a 1,000-year period of peace and righteousness on earth, as described by the New Testament in the book of Revelation. So he believed that, hey, these 144,000 would be resurrected and that they would reign as kings and priests with Christ during the millennium, and they would serve as a spiritual governing body on earth, aka that's the special purpose that Russell was talking about. However, as the number of the Jehovah's Witnesses grew beyond the 144,000 members, Russell and later leadership started to adjust this interpretation and to introduce concepts such as a secondary spiritual class who would also gain salvation and have special purposes, but would have different roles than the 144,000. So I just wanted to make mention of that the Jehovah's Witnesses as a group and a leadership has really morphed their idea of what the 144,000 means in retrospect to their growing numbers of believers. Regarding the Trinity, Russell believed in the divinity of Christ, but he differed from Orthodox Christian teachings that Jesus had received the divinity as a gift from God. So let me rephrase this, because I think I might have said it in a confusing way. So Russell did believe that Jesus was divine. He didn't believe that he was co-equal with God, but he believed that Jesus was a lesser second being that was divine, but not co-equal with God, but equally divine with God. He differed with Orthodox Christian teachings that believe that Jesus and God are co-equal branches of the same divine being. Rather, they're separate. And he believed that Jesus received his divinity at a later point, after dying on the cross. Because of his sacrifice, God is pleased, and thus God makes him divine. That is, if you remember from our lecture on Christianity, when we talked about the lost Christianities, these other early forms of Christianities, this is kind of a form of adoptionism. The adoptionists. Russell believed in that. Russell believed that the Holy Spirit wasn't actually a person either, so it wasn't the third part of the Trinity. He actually believed that the Holy Spirit is just merely a manifestation of God's power, so that the idea of the Holy Spirit really doesn't exist within Jehovah's Witness movement. It's just God and Jesus. But God is ultimately the supreme creator deity being, and Jesus is a lesser being who is made divine. This is a different thing that you don't hear about much, and this was very popular in the late 19th century, but I want to mention it here because I just find it fascinating. Charles Russell taught this idea of pyramid oleology. Russell believed that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built by the ancient Jewish people of the Old Testament. This idea that we get of the Jewish people as being slaves in Egypt building the pyramid kind of comes from this movement that emerged in the late 19th century and really was popularized in America by the Jehovah's Witnesses as a group, and thus some Protestant churches and Protestant ideology kind of adopted this belief as well, until it was later disproven, and not necessarily like, oh, the Jews built the pyramids. Archaeology, disproved that, and most Protestants don't care, and it's fine with that. But originally, they believed that the Jews had built the pyramid, and they built it under God's direction, not that of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh might have commanded it, but it was for God's purpose. And so Russell held that certain biblical texts, including like Isaiah 19, prophesied a future understanding of the Great Pyramid, and that he believed that the pyramids of various ascending and descending passages represented biblical concepts such as the fall of man, the provisions of the law of Moses, the death of Christ, the exaltations of saints in heaven, meaning that he believed that the construction of the pyramid was an allegory, a physical manifestation of an allegory that could be used to educate people about the truths of the Bible. I think at this time, I could be wrong, but from my understanding is that at this time, this is when the insides of the Great Pyramid of Giza were kind of significantly uncovered by British archaeologists and European archaeologists, and so all this excitement was around it, and thus Russell wanted to incorporate some of those beliefs. Russell believed that various calculations regarding the pyramid, and the end times. He believed that the pyramids um, witnessed that the close of the 1914 year would be this kind of beginning of the end time of nations. And he based it off calculations of steps and the pyramids, the blocks that were there, that it led to the year 1914 as this very important year that we'll talk about here in a little bit moment. So it kind of bleeded into his ideas of the advent of Christ, that he married the two with these beliefs about the pyramids, that they have secret meanings and alternative purposes that we just don't understand yet. But he did. And he also believed in the idea of Christian Zionism. And so we already kind of talked about religious Zionism within Judaism. But here specifically, I want to introduce this idea of Christian Zionism, and what that means. Russell taught that God's favor had been restored to the Jews as a result of a prophetic double, what he would call, in which had ended in the year 1878. So kind of bringing back Nelson Barber's prophecy of Jesus coming back in 1878. He kind of took that and mirrored it and changed it around a little bit. And he argued that this favor actually switched from the year 1878, that the favor switched from Jacob to Jesus. Then this had appeared. And so he believed that Jews shouldn't be converted to Christianity, which was very novel at the time. There was this idea within Protestantism and missionaries, and there was a lot of efforts to publicly go out and missionize to the Jewish people, and that once the Jewish people all believed in Jesus as their Savior, then Jesus would come back from the second coming. Russell believed the opposite of that. He thought Jews should not convert to Christianity. He believed that the land of Palestine belonged exclusively to the Jewish race and to the Jewish people, and that God was actively, in the late 1890s and early 1900s, was actively working to call back the Jewish people to their homeland in Palestine. And you were seeing this movement of the Jewish people for the return, the Aliyah, the return to their ancestral homes in Palestine. But Russell also believed that a new reestablished Israel would be then the centerpiece of God's kingdom on earth. And so that once the Jews were able to reestablish Israel as their own kingdom, Palestine as their own homeland of Israel, that would be the start to the end of the world. That would be the beginning of the second coming of Jesus Christ, because now biblical prophecy is fulfilled. So thus, that's why Russell was very, very emphatic that the Jews do not convert to Christianity, because he believed that, well, the Jewish people themselves must return to Palestine. They must reestablish the nation of Israel again, and they must try to start rebuilding the third temple as prophesied by the book of Isaiah. And so he went very public about this and prophesied that the Jewish people would have their land and that the land would be restored to them. And this is all going, coinciding with the efforts of Theodor Herzl that we talked about in the Zionist movement in the early 1890s, and the Zionist Congress that was happening. Russell was a very big supporter of this. And so, but he believed that all of this needed to happen for the benefit of the Christian faith. And so this is why we call it Christian Zionism. So it's a form of Christianity that supports Jewish Zionism. But it's not for the benefit of the Jewish people, but in truth, it's actually the benefit of Christianity and the belief in the second coming of Christ. And so Christian Zionism still really heavily exists today. It's still very popular. And so there's a lot of Christians who are very strong supporters of Israel. So anytime that Israel does get into these conflicts with the Palestinian people, or with their Arab and Muslim neighbors of the Middle East, you always have Americans here who rise up and are very strong supporters of the Jewish people, and they'll often cite biblical passages. And so many of these people are a part of the Christian Zionist movement. And so they publicly finance and publicly support the state of Israel and retaking the land away from Palestinians in order to bring about their own Christian beliefs. So that is a reality that's out there. People like John Hagee, a prominent minister in Houston, I think it's Houston, maybe San Antonio, but he's always on television if you stay up late at night. But he's a very strong proponent of this Christian Zionist movement. And so it's a reality, but it kind of had its births, moments within the Jehovah's Witness movement, but it branched out to evangelicalism and to Christianity, especially after the Balfour Declaration in 1916, and especially after the British Mandate ended in 1948 and the establishment of Israel as a nation, and the subsequent Arab and Jewish wars that happened since 1948 up until our present day. And why I bring this up is because Russell publicly started prophesizing this starting in 1910, that the Jewish people would get their homeland eventually. And so when the Balfour Declaration happened in 1916, it really ramped up and amplified the movement of the Jehovah's Witness as a movement, because of the influence that Russell's prophecies seem to be coming true now. And so it gave bigger credence to him as a religious leader, and it gave better credence to his movement as a religious movement. The last thing that I want to talk about concerning what he taught, and perhaps his lasting legacy, is his prediction regarding the second coming of Christ. In 1874, again influenced by lots of Adventist Christian teachings and even his own calculations, Russell initially believed that Christ had actually already returned in the year 1874, but his return was invisible, just like Barber talked about. and that Christ's return marked a specific beginning, which he would call the harvest period, which is the title of one of his books, where true Christian believers would start gathering and start correcting what is known as the great apostasy. So giving credence to the emergence of his religious movement, and giving credence to his work on the religious stage in America. And so, like the first apostles of the early church, Russell and his followers needed to aggressively evangelize their corrected faith to the whole world before Jesus would physically return. And Russell pointed to a biblical passage that spoke about Christ's presence, or his parousia, his second coming in the Greek means, to support his idea, arguing that the second coming of Christ would involve a period of invisible presence or invisible spirit before a visible manifestation of Christ would occur. In 1978, after Nelson's failed biblical prophecy didn't occur, Russell instead believed that this period marked what he called the fall of Babel, and arguing that arguing that it was a symbolic interpretations of God's judgment on all of Christianity, or Christendom, as we would call it. Russell argued that his followers should start separating themselves from what he considered to be the Babylonian churches: Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, Orthodox, Presbyterians, churches. And so he, in a sense, created this kind of urgency and purpose amongst his own followers, and started to motivate them to not only spread their message, but to start a new religious movement. And unlike many pre-tribulation rapture Christians believe, like Baptists and Methodists, Russell did not believe in a secret rapture of saints before the tribulation, but instead taught that believers would live through a tumultuous period that would lead up to Christ's second return. And so he prophesied that in 1914, so this is happening in the early 1880s, but he prophesied that 1914 would mark what he called the end of the Gentile time. Russell believed that in this period, when Gentiles, non-Jewish nations, would dominate the world, everyone but the Jews, and that period was a divine endpoint for the world to end. Russell based his calculations on prophecies in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, verse 16, which speaks of 7 times passing over Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And Russell interpreted these 7 times as symbolically applying the day-year principle, and so arriving at this 2,520-year calculation period that he had calculated. And so he identified 607 as the year as the starting point of the quote unquote Gentile time, because that's when the first time the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and ending the independent Jewish kingdom forever. And so calculating from 606 and on, that's 2,520 years, Russell arrives at the date 1914. As this is when the period of the Gentile people would be ended, and that the period of Israel as of the Jewish people reestablishing the nation of Israel would occur. And thus, when that happens, the start of Armageddon, the start of the end of days, the last judgment, Christ's return, everything happens. So what happened in world history in 1914? What made it seem like Russell's prophecies and predictions were true? The start of World War I happened in 1914. The scale and brutality of World War I was unlike anything that the world had seen. before major global powers, new technologies of warfare, and unprecedented casualties had occurred. Nearly 40 million people died during World War One. To put that in perspective, that's 30 American civil wars happening. It's a kind of war that's never been seen on this scale. That's why we call it the Great War or World War One, and why we talk about it so much. And so when these atrocities started to happen, this seemed to be a prophecy of what Russell was talking about. The Gentile world, the non-Jewish world, was coming to an end because you had Germany, you had England, you had France, you had Austria, you had Turkey, you had the United States, you had Italy, you had all of Europe, Russia, all of Europe fighting against each other, conquering and defeating one another in massive bloody battles of war. At the same time, you had the Balfour Declaration in 1916. You had the British Prime Minister wanting and pushing for the establishment of the Jewish people and the Jewish homeworld again. So it looked like this was happening. It looked like everything that Russell had prophesied was becoming true. And so his movement exploded after that. And so that's why, even though we know Jesus Christ's second coming didn't occur after World War One, and there was a lot of explaining to do, and we'll talk about that here in a second, that's why this is so important, because it escalated what Russell was doing. It escalated the rise of the Jehovah's Witness as a new religious movement with staying power in the history of the United States. Because at this point, you saw with the Millerites, all of William Miller's prophecies were untrue. With Nelson Barber, all of his prophecies were untrue. But now with Russell, you actually have prophecies coming true, seeming to be coming true. And so now Russell has staying power, where the Millerites and Barber's Church of the Strangers faded away because it had no staying power. But now this movement does. But unfortunately, in 1913, Russell's health began to deteriorate. He apparently suffered from like a urinary tract disease that he had. And he never treated it. Instead, like a man, toughed it out. And eventually, he died on a speaking tour that he had throughout the American Southwest. That he died in 1916. Before the end of World War One. He died somewhere out in Texas while he was on a speaking tour, and was subsequently returned back to Pittsburgh, back to his hometown, and was buried. And so that's the culmination of Charles Russell Taze. And as we talked about with founder movements really succeed on the founder, but they also really succeed on the right successor. We saw this with Islam, with the four rightly guided caliphs. We saw this with Mormonism, with the leadership mantle passing from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young. We saw this with Scientology, with the leadership starting with L. Ron Hubbard and then passing to David Miscavige. That way of succession allows for success. And so the new religious movement needed to have the right successor. And to some extent, they did with the personhood of the next important character of the Jehovah's Witness as a religious movement, and that of their second president of the Zionist Watchtower, and who eventually created the Jehovah's Witness as a religious group, Joseph Franklin Rufford. So that's who we want to talk about now. So as I said, Taze, Charles Russell Taze died, or Charles Taze Russell died in October of 1916. In January of 1917, the Watchtower Society appointed its own legal counselor, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, as Russell's successor and president of the Watchtower Society. Rutherford was born a Baptist originally in Missouri in the 1860s. He developed a very keen interest in the law, studying the law, and even though his father was a farmer, his father was very unsupportive of what he did. So Rutherford um, became a lawyer the tough way. Worked his way through college. Actually had to pay his father for the right to go to college, which is very interesting. But he was successful, and he became a lawyer in 1892 for the Missouri. He passed the Missouri bar at that time, and he began working for the Judicial Circuit Court of Missouri, where he picked up the name Judge Rutherford. So sometimes you see in writings they might say Joseph Franklin Rutherford, or they might call him Judge Rutherford, or just the Judge. That was the nickname because he was a lawyer, and he did, for a period of time, act as a judge in the state of Missouri for a while. And in 1909, he then left Missouri and went to New York and became a lawyer there, where he started to practice actually before the Supreme Court as a lawyer. So he was a pretty decent lawyer. And according to Rutherford's biographer, he first encountered the Jehovah's Witness as a religious movement in 1894, when two missionaries, two colporteurs, visited his office and left various religious tracts about Charles Russell Tay, or Taze Russell, and it really influenced Rutherford. That he really liked what he saw, and he had similar beliefs. He saw all religions as being very insincere, being shallow, being hypocritical, was very turned off by religion, but instead he was struck by the command of Russell's teaching, his education, his interpretation of the Bible, and his biblical prophecies, and his critiques on mainstream Christianity. So Rutherford immediately started conversations with the Watchtower Society, and began attending many of their groups informally for about 12 years before he was officially made a member of the Jehovah's Witness group, or the Watchtower Society. He became the lawyer of the Watchtower Society in 1907, and began legal counsel there. But he also worked as a speaker and an evangelist along with Russell, and actually traveled with Russell until Russell's health started deteriorating. And then he actually started traveling on his own on behalf and sanctioned and blessed by Russell and what he was doing. And so he had a very famous public debate in 1915 where he debated a famous Baptist preacher, J. Stroll, in Los Angeles at a very public event, a huge audience at the time of 12,000 participants, where he debated various aspects of the Christian faith, debated on the nature of hell, on the second coming of Christ, and Rutherford really stole the show, according to all reports. And it helped him start becoming a publisher as well of Jehovah's Witness materials. I think he published an article called "The Great Battle in Heaven," which he defends Russell and his teachings, and attacks other mainstream forms of Christianity. So he becomes a very prominent leader. So by the time 1916 happens and Charles was dead, Rutherford was already one of the prominent members of the board of directors for the Watchtower Society, especially as their lawyer as well. And so when Russell passed away, there was no immediate succession plan for the Watchtower Society. If I remember right, I think Russell was divorced, so he was kind of estranged from his children. So it wasn't clear who was going to be the successor. And so several suitors began lobbying for control. So you have people like Alfred Ritchie, William Van Allburn, Allburn, sorry, Robert Hirsch, Alexander Macmillan, as well as Rutherford himself. They were all top candidates to succeed successors. But however, for some reason, Rutherford, when the Jehovah's Witnesses met for their 1917 convention in Pittsburgh to elect a member, for some reason Rutherford ran unopposed and won overwhelmingly. He was the only person on the ballot to vote for it, and so he ran, and he won, and so he became the president that way. Um, Rutherford himself is often painted and known for having a very strong personality and being very assertive in his leadership, which naturally led to clashes with other people within the leadership of the society. And so, four of the seven directors of the Watchtower Society, including Ritchie and Hirsch, began to publicly challenge Rutherford and his authority. They began accusing him of being a dictator, of being an autocrat, and they tried as a board to start limiting the powers of the presidency within the Watchtower Society. Rutherford countered these claims by saying that the directors were traitors, conspiring to seize control over the organization, and that they were trying to absolve the will of God. Uh, and he also, because he was a lawyer, went about seeking legal remedies to hold on to power, which he, as a lawyer, won surprisingly. And so once he went down the legal route and he was able to secure his control, the first thing he did was remove all members from the board of leadership. And so therefore there's only one sole leader of the Zionist Watchtower Society, and that was Rutherford. Um, Again, once his authority becomes solidified, Rutherford apparently published the last ever book that was reportedly written by Russell, and that was reportedly given to Rutherford prior to his death, which was titled The Finished Mystery. However, according to historians, even within the Jehovah's Witness movement, it's believed that the book was actually written by Rutherford himself, as well as other associates that he had, Woodworth and George Fisher. So this wasn't actually written by Russell, but actually by Rutherford, but he used Russell's death and power and influence to push forth his own agenda and his own interpretations, which marked a significant difference. The book primarily provides an interpretation of the biblical books of Ezekiel and Revelation, and puts forth various predictions and interpretations regarding the ongoing conflict of World War One. And you got to remember too, by 1917, this is when the Americans now enter World War One. So now Americans have a greater interest and a greater involvement and a greater concern about the fate of World War One. And so he equated the events of World War One naturally with the end of days, but he also contains within it very strong criticism of organized religion, and particularly the Catholic Church and the Church of England, accusing its clergy in the involvement of starting World War One. He claimed that it was actually these churches, these mainstream forms of Christianity that started the religion, or started the outbreak of World War One. That it wasn't, the death of Archduke Ferdinand. It wasn't because of all the treaties. It wasn't all of these reasons that we study in world history or in American history. Instead, all of the fault lies with organized religion. The book also blames the cause of World War One on what Rutherford called an alliance with beastly governments. That he blamed patriotism, he blamed nationalism, he blamed loyalty to countries for the devastations that were occurring in Europe and in the Middle East. He goes on later in the book to say patriotism only leads to murder. And in the book, he encourages people to start abstaining from any national association with countries and abstaining from displays of patriotisms, taking down the American flag from your house, refusing to support the war effort, refusing to volunteer and join the army. And if you're forced to join the army to fight because there was the draft that was called up, that you should leave because you shouldn't be supporting this. Naturally, this doesn't go well with various governments who were in the midst of World War One. And so in February of 1918, the Canadian government banned Rutherford's book, the Finished Mystery, banned it from distribution, and even started to ban Jehovah's Witnesses tract distributions as well, describing it as, quote, seditious and, quote, full of anti-war statements. That's Canada. The next month, March 1918, the U.S. Army intelligence seized various Watchtower Society offices throughout the United States and many of their publication services, starting to confiscate all Watchtower Society literature that was being distributed and made. And then by May of 1918, the U.S. attorney issued an arrest warrant for Rutherford and several other directors within the Watchtower Society, who were all charged under the 1917 Espionage Act with, quote, attempting to cause insubordination, attempting to cause disloyalty, attempting to refuse the refusal of duty in the armed forces, and attempting to obstruct the recruitment and enlistment of servicemen of the U.S. while it was at war, end quote. Those are some serious charges. And by June of 1918, Rutherford was sentenced. He was found guilty of violating the Espionage Act and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But however, Rutherford was released in May of 1919 after winning his appeal. And in May of 1920, the U.S. government, he won again an appeal and forced the U.S. government to expunge Rutherford's record of being a traitor. And so that relationship caused some angst, some permanent angst between Rutherford and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then later other governments and nations, but more specifically the United States, regarding the loyalties of the Jehovah's Witnesses and its members within the country. So I wanted to keep that in mind because we're going to revisit it here in a little bit. But following his release from prison, Rutherford began a major reorganization of the Watchtower Society and the Bible study movement that Russell had started. In May of 1919, Rutherford began publishing Jehovah's Witness materials from religious tract-looking styles, small pamphlets, small booklets, into a magazine, to a full-fledged magazine, and he called the magazine the Watchtower. Um, uh, uh, this was an illustrated religious magazine, and that was published and distributed by the Jehovah's Witness, and was seen and used as a popular means for evangelization as well as recruitment tool for new members. Jehovah's Witness members would then reorganize themselves in order to start distributing these magazines door to door. And that's kind of what the Jehovah's Witnesses do today. They don't give you little small booklets or tracts or pamphlets anymore. Instead, they give you a magazine that has their materials within it. So it looks like a popular like Popular Mechanics magazine. It's high gloss pages, very well designed, well organized, well published, well written, with lots of creative pictures that look very familiar, very biblical, things that you would see in Sunday school, things that you would be used to seeing in a Christian setting. So it was very appealing. Rutherford expanded the society's printing facilities and revived and rebranded the term colporteurs to publishers instead, as their missionaries. And then in 1920, Rutherford introduced the requirement for weekly reports on members regarding their preaching activity, and which is now a staple part of the Jehovah's Witness life within their church, that each member has a report that is collated on them, and that they're encouraged and required to go out and publicly evangelize in the publicly distribute their materials in order to stay within the church or suffer disfellowship. And he even expanded and reorganized their overseas Bible study groups into branches, into offices, into churches, or to kingdom halls in this sense, to help evangelize even more. So they began to grow even more in the UK, particularly in Germany prior to World War II, and Italy as well. In 1925, Rutherford gained full control over what doctrinal materials would be taught in the Watchtower publications. He later published new articles called The Deliverance, which contained very significant doctrinal changes. And the biggest was concerning the name of God and the use of Christianography as well. And so we'll talk about that. Rutherford believed that God's name had been obscured and neglected by traditional Christianity. He saw restoring its use as an essential to true worship of a Christian. He pointed to the frequent use of God's name in the original Hebrew scripture, the Latinization of Yahweh to Jehovah. And so he argued that should be the given prominence of it. And really quickly, like I said, Jehovah is the Latinization of the Hebrew name for God, Yahweh, as we already discussed in Judaism lecture. And this idea of Jehovah came about in the 16th century with an English Protestant reformer, William Tyndale, who first introduced the word in his translation of the Bible as a kind of protest against the Catholic Church, to refer to to try to help distinguish the two new the forming religion of Protestantism from Catholicism. Rutherford wanted to do the same thing that Tyndale wanted to do, using Jehovah as a way to help distinguish and as a way to protest other Christian denominations as well. He wanted to reinforce their unique identity as a new religious movement. Rutherford also taught that it was important that his followers should only use the name Jehovah when referring to God exclusively, because that's his real name. You couldn't say God, you couldn't say Lord. That's not his name. His name is Jehovah, and you need to use it. And lastly, Rutherford believed that by using God's real name was seen as a way of fostering a closer personal experiential relationship with the divine, which is again the true purpose and the true goal of the Christian life, is to have a personal relationship, a personal experience with God. So the best way to do that is call him by his name, by his real name. He'll answer to that. Um, Concerning Christian iconography, iconography is just a fancy word for images, religious images to be specific. Nearly all forms of Protestantism reject the use of some kind of iconography within the church. Um, Stained glass windows are okay, but typically what you see in most all Protestant churches is one iconography that's used, the cross, and particularly an empty cross. If you go to a Baptist church, you're never going to see a cross that has Jesus hanging on it. It's always going to be an empty cross, because that's just about the only acceptable iconography image that is left within the Protestant church. But for Catholics, so much of what Catholics do and believe is really reinforced by the iconography. The iconography has a metaphorical, a spiritual lesson that can be passed out and passed along to its believers. Rutherford rejected all Christian iconography. Thus, the Jehovah's Witnesses are like Muslims and like Jews in the sense that they are what we call iconoclastics, meaning that they're against icons, the use of religious imagery within their worship and services. Rutherford especially rejected the use of the cross in any formation, whether Jesus is on it or Jesus is not on it. He rejected the cross as a Christian religion or Christian image for several reasons. One, he would cite historical inaccuracies. Rutherford believed that the Greek word for cross, staurus, which is again translated often as cross, actually referred to a pole or an upright stake. And so he argued that the Bible provides no evidence that the cross was shaped that way, a T-shaped sign. There's no way. There's no evidence of that. Instead, the Greek word that's being used just simply means a pole or a stake. So Jesus was just hung from a pole. So historical inaccuracy there. Jehovah's Witnesses are quite literal. So why do we have a cross if we cannot confirm that that's exactly what the Bible says? It seems to indicate another word, a pole or a stake being used. And that makes sense, because even Muslims would say then said Jesus was hung on a tree. Citing Deuteronomy that says, "Cursed is the one who hangs from a tree." It's reasons why Muslims or Jews don't believe in Jesus, because they'll cite that passage as well. So even in their traditions, they don't see a cross. Instead, they see a tree, because there's some ambiguity there. So that's one, historical inaccuracy. Number two is early Christian art. Rutherford cited recent historical and archaeological research at the time, which suggested that the early Christians did not use the cross as a symbol of their faith. Instead, that they would use symbols like the Ichthys fish, the fish that the little fish that we see on the bumpers of cars, or that they would use the Greek letters Alpha and Omega to represent Christianity or represent Jesus, or that they would use images of a shepherd with a lamb, or they would have various combinations of various monographs within Latin, like XI or IH, which meant for Jesus. XI was Jesus Christ's name in Greek, or just XP, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, Christos, is XP, or it's actually a R sounding in Greek, but it looks like a P. So they would have those symbols, an X or IX for Jesus Christ, IH for Jesus, or XP for Christ, or Christ Jesus. Um, and Rutherford also believed that the adoption of the T cross shape was a very much later adoption within Christian art, but that the T-shaped cross was very much an influence by pagan practices rather than being an influence of true Christian practices. So he didn't like it. Third, he believed that the cross was a poor symbol. Rutherford saw that the cross as only a symbol of death and suffering, and that it was very inappropriate for a true representation of the resurrected and glorified Christ. Additionally, Rutherford felt that the cross focused too much on Christ's death rather than focusing on the actual teachings and the actual life of Jesus. So therefore, we need to get rid of it. And then lastly, he believed that the better focus of Christianity should be less on Christ and focused more on God or Jehovah. So by shifting away from the cross, Rutherford is emphasizing the importance of God, and specifically God's real name, Jehovah, as the central true element of real Christian worship. And then fifth is he wanted to distance himself from mainstream Christianity. So that's a definitely way to do it, because again, you go to a Catholic service, you go to Orthodox, you go to pretty much any Protestant services, they're all going to have crosses in some shape or form. But if you go to a Kingdom Hall service, you go to a Jehovah's Witness service, you ain't seeing any crosses. So it's massive distinction and distancing themselves between mainstream Christianity and others to help make them segmented. He also, in 1927, Rutherford declared Christians should not celebrate Christmas. That he argued that Christmas, as it's traditionally celebrated in the United States, is actually very much a pagan holiday, and that much of the traditions that we keep and that we do are actually associated with Germanic paganism rather than Christianity. So therefore, we need to stop Christmas. He called Christmas Satan's organization. So he was very much anti-Christmas. Rutherford also forbid members of the Jehovah's Witnesses from celebrating other events, like their own birthdays, or even celebrating Mother's Day, because he believed that the focus for every member of the Jehovah's Witness movement should be on God and not themselves. By celebrating your birthday, by celebrating Mother's Day, Father's Day, Flag Day, Christopher Columbus Day, Halloween, whatever, that's shifting the focus away from where it should be. So therefore, don't celebrate it. Don't celebrate off, because those things are very internal. It puts the focus on you. Instead, the focus needs to be on God. So Jehovah's Witnesses do not celebrate holidays. They do not celebrate their birthdays. So if you do have a Jehovah's Witness friend, it's quite rude to try to get them a birthday cake, or to get them a birthday gift, or get them a Christmas gift within your office. Be mindful of that. Also, something that's very unique to the Jehovah's Witness as well is that Jehovah's Witness followers are prohibited from blood transfusions. So this was new technology that was emerging during Rutherford's time as presidency, and particularly after, more so after his presidency, but I wanted to bring it up here because he does vaguely mention it because it's a new technology that's coming out. So regarding blood and blood transfusions, the Jehovah's Witness interprets several passages from the book of Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, as well as Acts chapter 15, if I remember right, which commands followers from abstaining from blood, particularly the consumption of blood. In these passages, they're always in reference to consuming meat that has blood in them, or consuming meat that's been sacrificed to other gods. So just that consume, so not have, meat that has blood. So eating a very rare steak, or even a medium rare steak, or possibly medium well, even, that you can't eat that because of the hint of blood that still might be in the meat. That's forbidden. But that also applied to other things like blood transfusion. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that blood represented life, and that life is thoroughly sacred to God, according to Genesis chapter 4, if I remember right. So therefore, their faith dictates that Jehovah's Witnesses must maintain a strict obedience to God's laws, and that obedience to God's law is paramount, even with facing life-threatening situations. So that means that Jehovah's Witnesses do not receive transfusions when they're having surgeries at hospitals. They instead argue what happens to them is they have bloodless surgeries. That's what doctors call them. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses advocate for. They also may not have organ transplants, which may require blood transfusions as well. So for this point, it's very important that medical doctors need to know a patient's religion because of these aspects of a Jehovah's Witness. They're not supposed to have a blood transfusion, even if they're unconscious and the doctor doesn't know per se, and they put an IV in them and give the person blood because they're losing blood from a cut. That ain't acceptable within Jehovah's Witness tradition. So that's why if you're going into the medical field, your professors might tell you about asking a patient's religious objections, because what they're trying to say, are they Jehovah's Witness? Because that's an important aspect for what they do. And then lastly, what's very interesting is based off, remember, back again to Rutherford blaming World War I, not only on organized religion, but also specifically on patriotism. In preparation for the advent of World War II, Rutherford objected to various U.S. state laws that required school students to salute the flag as a means of instilling patriotism while the country was at war. He declared that baptized Jehovah's Witness members who did salute the flag were breaking their covenant with God and were thus guilty of death and punishment. So it was very a serious matter for the members of the Jehovah's Witness Church not to salute the flag, not to pledge allegiance. So of course, that's countries at war. This is getting him in trouble quickly. So in 1940, Rutherford began challenging the U.S. government in court regarding the constitutionality of forcing children to salute the flag, or forcing really anybody to salute the flag, and expelling those students from school who do not choose to salute the flag. Thus, during the court cases, the Supreme Court cases actually, of Minersville School District versus Goptis in 1940, the Supreme Court ruled that public schools at the time could compel students to salute the American flag and could compel students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance despite a student's religious objections to these practices. Rutherford was quite pissed at this and looked for ways to appeal this. And eventually, even though he died before this court case came about, he was successful in helping get another court case to the courts to help appeal the previous decision. And so in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett in 1943, the U.S. Supreme Court publicly reversed its previous decision in Minersville versus Gobtis, holding that the First Amendment does protect a student's right from being forced to salute the American flag or said Pledge of Allegiance in a public school setting. So this was a huge victory for the Jehovah's Witness, but it was also a huge reshaping of the religious dialogue surrounding freedom of religion in the United States. So this is another reason why the Jehovah's Witnesses are very important in the organization and history of us as a country, as a people in America. And so Rutherford should be studied, and these two court cases should be looked at and talked about because of their influences in reshaping the narrative concerning freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and what does that look like. All right, so our very last lecture or slide that I want to talk about is kind of where are the Jehovah's Witnesses now. So from the age of 70 until his death in 1942, Rutherford underwent several medical treatments for colon cancer, and all of them were quite unsuccessful. And so eventually Rutherford died in his mansion in San Diego in 1942, and Rutherford was succeeded by Nathan Homer Knorr as president of the movement. And Knorr's tenure is notable and should be talked about within the history of the Jehovah's Witness as a movement, because it transferred from individual leadership and authority and power that Rutherford had established back to a corporal leadership and corporate leadership that Charles Taze Russell had kind of informally established within the old Watchtower Society. From 1972 until 1976, Knorr became the catalyst for the denomination to adjust its organizational structure. So the Jehovah's Witnesses became more Bible-centered again. And so he said it's noteworthy that the Bible does not say whether it was only one elder or one overseer, the official language that the Bible used, for each congregation, meaning the denomination, but rather it indicated numbers, elders, overseers, so that there should be a plurality of leadership and based off biblical interpretations that Paul talks about in his epistles. There would no longer be one congregation servant or overseer at each individual Kingdom Hall, but rather a body of elders that would oversee the ministerial services of each local Kingdom Hall. Again, making it more democratic, making it more biblical in that sense. Equally, the global authority of the Jehovah's Witnesses passed from the president of the Watchtower Society to a new governing an elected body of officials elected by the Jehovah's Witnesses as a movement, and that the Jehovah's Witnesses headquarters is going to be in Brooklyn, New York, which I think it was for a long, long time until I think maybe in 2009, 2010, when the economy kind of crashed, that the Jehovah's Witnesses left New York and reestablished another headquarters somewhere else, but I can't remember. I think it's still in New York, possibly out on Long Island, further out on Long Island, but no longer are they in Brooklyn, New York. Um, and this governing body would form several subcommittees that would then oversee various things like publications. They would oversee official doctrines and teachings in a collegial manner, in a collegial way. So it wasn't just Rutherford, like it was in the past, just making up new doctrines and going and forcing those beliefs on everybody else, but it was a collective democratic process. And while the governing body would continue to have an elected president, the governance of the movement was no longer in the hands of one man, but now within an entire organization. So I think Noor should get some credit for making this more into a global and more recognizable religious movement instead of a kind of autocracy that it had become under Rutherford. Um, Today, the Jehovah's Witnesses do have. Well, before I do that, I want to talk about there was some internal during the 1980s. There were some internal dissatisfaction within the Jehovah's Witness movement that led to a lot of investigations, self-investigations, a lot of self-inquisitions into people, and it led to a lot of severe breakups within the movement, and you had a lot of people being forcibly expelled from the Jehovah's Witnesses as a group. They were labeled spiritual fornicators, and so it really harmed the growth of the denomination. The denomination was quite large by the 1980s, but with them kind of attacking each other and going after each other, accusing each other of not being Jehovah's Witness enough in that sense, it really started to break up the Jehovah's Witness as a unified movement. And so you start now having a lot of splinter groups that have kind of emerged informally. The larger organization of the JW doesn't recognize these ones, and so that's where I talk about that. The numbers are actually much higher than the 8.8 that they officially give, but instead, um, it's because of this happening in the 1980s, this kind of informal breakup that occurred that really caused a lot of hurtful division. So a lot of Jehovah's Witness members left. And if you talk to a lot of elder ones, they'll cite this period in the 1980s and early 1990s that was really the crux of why they left their religion or left their faith. And it was also by this time, too, that's when some tones began to change again, how Protestants and Catholics would see Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would start label and using terms like cult behind them because of these practices that they saw in the 1980s, a very strict obedience and strict punishment that was being put on its members, and the way they were using this fellowshipping was very much harmful. And it felt like a religious cult that was going on. So I just wanted to mention that. And so this kind of purge resulted in numbers of schisms being happening informally within the Jehovah's Witness movement. I'm not aware of any official segmented denomination within the Jehovah's Witness movement, just like the Mormon Church. There is the LDS Church, the official church, but then there's also branches within Mormonism. There's the Reform LDS movement, and then there's the really Orthodox, conservative, extremist form, the fundamentalist LDS Church as well. So there's those kind of segmented denominations within the Jehovah's Witness movement. I'm not aware of that, but it does informally exist, that there are branches within them, but they haven't been properly cataloged or properly made official, like the Reformed Church of the LDS, which has. So, lastly, today, where they stand, the Jehovah's Witnesses do have an active presence in most countries across the globe. The only areas where you really don't find Jehovah's Witnesses that are being reported is predominantly in Muslim countries of North Africa and the Middle East. But pretty much every other country that you can go on their website and look where there are members, there's a lot of them. You can see a lot of countries that are listed there, but you will notice a large gap within their alphabet list of countries, and most of them you'll notice are in Muslim countries where the Jehovah's Witnesses are not welcome. And again, while most statistical numbers report the global membership of around 8.8 million followers, scholars actually believe that that number is much higher, as the Jehovah's Witnesses only count and report those members who are listed as active publishers. So world data and global surveys actually report the numbers of Jehovah's Witnesses around 21 million people who self-identify as Jehovah's Witnesses, which would make them a much larger religious organization, would put them almost on par with something like Sikhism that has a similar kind of number. So a very large religious movement. But because of what happened in the 1980s, and what happened with the purges that left to a number of schisms of disfellowship members. This is where the official number I don't think is actually accurate, but instead I think the other global data number that gets reported of around 21 million is probably the more accurate. And it's a good reflection of a good last lesson about self-identification. And that is important, of how you, as individuals, see themselves and letting the individual voice be heard within the religious structure of today. And so that concludes our lecture on the Jehovah's Witness.